All right, so objects. Um, Really, like today's going to be the overview of object, kind of what they do, what are general properties, how do we create it, how do we access it, how do we delete things, and then tomorrow is also on objects. But tomorrow's lecture on objects will be more similar to yesterday's lecture on arrays, which is, hey, what are all the fancy, cool things that objects are built with, right? All the methods that come with JavaScript and how to use them. So today's more of an intro to objects, and then tomorrow's like how do we use objects, how do we use certain object shortcuts and methods to do more powerful things. So what is an object? The definition that you'll hear a lot is just it's a store of key value pairs, or in this case, a collection of key value pairs. In Python, an object is called a dictionary, and I actually think that's a very good kind of analogy for what an object kind of conceptually is, right? Up until now, arrays basically just hold a list of things, and often without much context, right? Like, so if I say to you, hey, this array has three things, one of which is my favorite animal, one of which is my favorite color, one of which is my favorite restaurant, and I say, can you guess which one it is? The short answer is probably not, right? Because the point of the array is that it's just a list of information without context, right? If I told you the first thing is my favorite color, the second thing is my favorite restaurant, and the third thing is my favorite whatever I said earlier, then you could say, okay, then I can understand it with that context. But if I just give you a list of three things and tell you what's in them, you actually don't know which one's which, right? Similarly, like whereas an object can be akin to a dictionary, an array is just like a list of words, right? Like here are all the words that English has, right? But without any context as to what they are or what they mean. So the reason why people call it a key value pair is much like in a dictionary, the key will be the word, and the value could be thought of as a definition, right? So word definition is analogous to key value pair in the way that we use it here for objects. Um, in arrays, we access certain things by passing it a what? How do I access an element in an array? I give it an index, right? I give it a number. Say, hey, give me the sixth thing, or give me like the thing at index, and I give a number. And for objects, we actually access it very similar, except now instead of accessing it by saying, give me the 5,000th word in a dictionary, if I'm trying to define a certain word, I say, hey, here's a word, give me its definition, right? It's like that's the kind of way that's one way to think about kind of how an object is like almost like a higher class version of an array. So here on line 6 there, we have our traditional array. It's a array with two values for both strings. But on line 8 there, if we actually wanted to create an object, then we would need two things. We need a key and a value, right? And a key and a value really for each one of those individual values. We'll talk more about kind of how to create this and how to read this later on. Objects are created with the curly braces. Obviously, don't get them confused with the way we create scope. But in the same way that in the same way that every array needs to have square brackets, every object needs to have the curly braces. And if you notice, I mean, hopefully this doesn't confuse folks. If I treat each key value pair, if I treat each, like, I guess, word definition as one thing, you'll see a comment here, right? And so when we say earlier, an object is just a collection of key value pairs, that's really all it is, right? It's saying key value pair 1, comma, key value pair 2, comma, right? So conceptually, it even kind of feels like an array too, right? Except now for each element, rather than just having one thing, we now have like one descriptor or one key and one value. So the comma basically means that all it is this is also just like an array is a collection of things. This is also a collection of things. The thing in here just has two values, if you will. Okay. So why are objects useful? I think I kind of gave it away already earlier, right? But objects really allow us to give context to value, to help us understand how do we access a lot of different things, right? If I have an array, if I have an array, and in this case it has three things, whoever's using this array needs to know at all times, hey, the second element is going to be BH, right? first element is going to be the name, and the third element is going to be the color, right? But with an object, rather than trying to have that be kind of opaque and having someone to memorize that, we can actually assign them actual descriptors or in actual keys to say, hey, in this object, which case is a cat, the name corresponds to the name. The age key corresponds to the age. The color key corresponds to the color. And now, whenever someone gets this object, there's no more ambiguity or there's no more kind of opaqueness about, oh, what do these values mean, right? The values are being described by the keys. And this is something that kind of like when we talk about naming variables, generally speaking, you want your key name, maybe the key is just another variable, right? But you want those names to be fairly descriptive. You want those names to be very clear on what it is that they're, what value they're representing. This is just kind of a quick aside, is that type of object is object. Type of array is also an object, and that's because an array and an object have a lot of similarities and they're implemented quite similarly in JavaScript. But just so you know, going forward, if you do want to check to see if something is an object or not, that's one way to do it. Obviously not the best way because there is this confusion with arrays potentially as well. Okay, so if I wanted to create a new object, there's a few kind of ground rules that JavaScript takes for granted. One is the key, and every key in an object has to be a string, right? Can't use numbers, can't use booleans, can't use other arrays or objects for the key, right? Just like how in the dictionary, it could be a graphical dictionary. Next to every word, there could be a picture, right? But the word has to be a word, right? The word has to be a string. So in this case, you will see here that these keys don't even have quotes around it to indicate it's a string. And that's because JavaScript is actually so strict with its enforcement that by definition, because you can only use strings, it's actually going to assume on your behalf that whatever you pass as a key is going to be a string. If you pass it the number 6, for example, what it'll do is it'll actually convert that 6 to a string before it stores it. So it will think that, oh, this is a string with one character, which happens to be a 6, right? So going forward, you can't treat it like it's a number. It's going to be a string, right? So just so you know, on the key side of things, JavaScript is very, very strict in that all keys have to be strings. Having said that, now that we know what the key is, we can actually access the value very similarly to the way that we access the value or the element in an array, right? In an array, we have our kind of our initial array / object here. We use bracket notations, and in an array, we pass it a number, which is going to be the index. For an object, we just pass it the key name, right? Here, we have to put quotes around, if this is the key name, we have to put quotes around it to denote that it's a string. Why do we do that? Okay?
Because you can probably put a variable in there that is equal to string.
Exactly, right? If I put name in quotes here, I know I'm looking for a key whose string is name, right? N-A-M-E, that is the name of the key. That is the key, right? If I don't have these quotes around this name can be a variable, right? And it could represent a completely different string. And so that's why when you create keys, you want to be very careful when we access certain keys, you want to be very, very careful that if this is the actual name of the key you want to access, put quotes on it so JavaScript knows that it's a string and not a variable. And now, if you keep going down this list now I can actually just specify, give me the name, age, and color of this, like I would a traditional, almost like a traditional dictionary would, right? If I have a dictionary of facts about this thing, I say, hey, what's name, what's color, what's age, what's the value associated with each one of these keys, I'll get it instantaneously. And then lastly, and as you probably could have predicted, if we do try to use a key that's not, that doesn't currently exist, what we're going to get for the value is going to be undefined, which means, hey, this could exist in the future, but for now, there's nothing there. It's not So here's to Ken's point earlier of or passing in key to check. There's no quotes around it, so JavaScript will say, okay, so key to check is not a string, it's not the actual key, it's just a variable. Let me check in my scope to see if I have a variable called key to check. I do, and this is a string with the word name. So now I can access variables that way as well for objects. Okay. Any questions on this before I move on to kind of like another way to access variables, which I think traditionally confuses people, but people like to use it because it's just shorter, but it's a bit more opaque. Francisco?
Sorry, so the first console log for that pushing key to check will return pushing, not name, right?
This one here?
Yeah.
Yeah, it will return pushing because this is going to evaluate to name, right? So the way that the computer will read line 12 is to say, okay, console.log. So the way the computers also read these things is because you have like an order of operations here, or parentheses and then brackets in the middle, it will start from the inside, from like the innermost thing first. And it'll say, okay, what's key to check? Key to check is a string name. Let's put its name here. All right, you're looking for a name property of Pusheen. What is that? That's going to be a string called Pusheen. And that's what gets logged out there. Josh?
Okay, so what if you make the object
Yep.
and you want to print the string name? What happens? Like, how do you do that?
You want to print the key?
No, you just want to print the word name. How would you be able to
you
do
get a
that?
key.
No.
Yeah.
Just the word name. Instead of Pusheen,
Yep.
print name.
Well, so you want to print out this thing here, right?
Yes, just the
Okay.
word name.
So that is the key,
So you
right?
can't.
This is the value. So in JavaScript, we'll cover it in a later slide. There is a way to access all the keys in an object, but think about it this way, right? When you go to a dictionary, right, you don't kind of go into saying, okay, you go to a dictionary with a word in mind to find a definition, right? You don't go to it with it saying, oh, okay, can you give me a word to look up, right? So usually so your question is very valid, right? It's like, how do we get access to the keys? And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But traditionally speaking, like the use case for objects usually is to me like, hey, like I have this thing and I want to know what the corresponding value of it is.
Well, I was just thinking, like, I just don't want that. Like, I want to, like, prevent that from happening, but it's, like, something that maybe might happen. Like, it might just print name instead. Or, like, I'm having trouble, like, trying to
Sure.
what I'm thinking in the words.
Sure.
But, like,
Think about it, and then at the end I'll come back to you,
Yeah.
and then you can re-ask the question at the end. Like it was potentially an example in mind that was put on the board, so we can look at it together.
Okay.
Cool. Andrew?
Oh no.
Cool. All right.
If I were to try to give pushing, there's no reason to do this, but like, if I wanted to add another key that was also named, would it return an error like, oh, you can't have two keys with the same name?
We'll talk about that in 2 more seconds. So everyone's comfortable with bracket notation, right? It's the idea that we are accessing with the bracket, we pass in the key. Cool. So the next one is the one that it just looks better, which is true, but it's also a lot trickier, or somewhat trickier to use, right? And it's something called dot notation. So dot notation, and by the way, everyone has access to the slides, correct? If you know how to get access to them, right? So if you want, feel free to pull us up on your computer and follow along as I talk up here. Like, I don't care if you're looking at me, as long as you can see the board to make sure that you're actually able to see all the code. Okay, so dot notation is another way to access objects, object values, just like bracket notation. The difference is, rather than doing bracket and passing in a string or a variable, we use pushing, we use dot, and then we pass in basically the name of the key. Okay, this is another area in which JavaScript is going to basically make the assumption on your behalf that whatever after dot is going to be a string, right? So when we do pushing dot name, it's going to say, okay, you want the name key on the object. What that also means is if we use dot notation, we can't use variables. right? Because by definition, dot's going to assume whatever key value you give it, it's going to be, that is literally going to be the name of the key. So down here then, if you notice on line 9 there, we have this variable called key to check, and we set it equal to the string name, right? Here when we do pushing.key to check, we get back undefined, okay? And the reason why is because down here, JavaScript is going to look at this and say, oh great, you want something, you want to access a key on this pushing object. Great, and you're using dot notation. Awesome. What key do you want? I want key to check. Great. Let me make a string called key to check and see if it exists on your pushing object. And it doesn't. So that's why we get back undefined. Okay? The reason why I say this is somewhat of a double-edged sword, especially when people are starting off using it, is I see so many folks, or I probably will see so many folks doing this today, right? Which is, oh, I have a variable and I want to use dot notation. It's not possible, right? If you want to use a variable, you have to use bracket notation. Dot notation is only if you know the exact explicit string value of that key. The other thing that you also can't do with dot notation is if you have a key with spaces, right? Can't do that with dot notation, because if I do, like if I want to have a key, that's called number of kids, I can make that a single string and use bracket notation pretty easy, right? I can't represent that with dot notation, right? Because the second I do dot num space, JavaScript is going to think, okay, great, you want the num key, right? And it's going to move on to the next thing. And it'll probably see the of and say, hey, this is a syntax error. There's no of here, right? So that's why even though dot notation always looks cleaner, right? People like if I just dot, there's no colors, there's no strings, this is very clean. Dot notation is cleaner, but it can do less things than bracket notation can. Bracket notation can handle keys with spaces, it can handle variables, and quite honestly, like if I'm walking around and you're using dot notation and running into headaches, I'll just tell you, hey, just use bracket notation for now because it's a lot more flexible. Any questions on dot notation specifically? Leo. It's only, as far as I'm aware, it's only preferred from a visual standpoint if you want your code to look cleaner. Functionally, I think bracket notation is universally just more productive, if you will, than dot notation. But hey, it looks cool, and that counts for a lot in today's world, so people use it. I mean, I use it too, don't get me wrong. Like sometimes it's just convenient to type, but like when you're starting off and learning about objects, just be careful with dot notation. It doesn't do everything that bracket notation can do. Is there another question on dot? On this side of the room? No? Okay, cool. All right, so adding a key value pair. Great, so obviously one way to create an object is when you're starting off just saying object equals curly brace and start adding values there, right? That totally works. What if, I've created an object and now I want to add more things to it? The really simple answer is, yeah, you almost just create a key out of thin air, right? So up here, there's no sister key, right? Instead, what I'm going to say is, hey, Pusheen's sister equals a string, right? I just create this key, right? This is basically the same as let x or let arr or let whatever, right? I'm just creating a new variable. In this case, the variable is going to be a key on this Pusheen object. I use an equal operator, and I assign a value to that variable. I assign a value to that key, right? And that is quite simply how I do it. Similarly, I can do the same exact thing with dot notation as well, right? Pusheen dot brother. If I cover up this side of the equation here, Pusheen dot brother is just me creating a new variable. This variable happens to be this key called brother on the Pusheen object. I set it equal to a string. I've now created just another key value pair on the Pusheen object. Cool, makes sense, right? Almost identical to how we create values in arrays if we wanted to, right? Array index of 6 equals, a string. Same way. Changing a value then. So I think this kind of gets to Francisco's question earlier of like, hey, what if I have a key and I want to replace it with something else, right? Well, if you do, then you're literally just replacing the value with something else, right? So here we define Pusheen, we say the age is 7. And then we do, down here we say, hey, Pusheen age equals 8. Well, this is the same as, if I have an array with 3 things, I say array index 0 equals something else. I'm just replacing the previous value with the new value, right? So whenever I do this, I'm just going to replace the value with the new value. At any given time, an object can only have one key of a given name. Basically, every key has to be unique in an object. And if you do have a case where you're trying to assign a new key, then it'll just overwrite the previous version of that key. Key names are always unique. You only have one key at a given time, right? It's not like an array where I can have an array of 6 identical values. In an object, every key has to be unique. Yes, Jillian?
So say there was no key named age below color, would it just assign, if you called age, would it call the second, like say you put 8, would it call 8, or would it say like error? Because there's 2 already within that.
Yeah, great question. So I think Jillian's question is, if we have another line after line 6 called age equals 8, right, down here,
Yeah.
Basically we're assigning age to their values. JavaScript reads the code top down, and so it will read age 7 and it'll read age 8, and age 8 will now replace age 7. So the final age will be 8. Computers generally don't have a problem with ambiguity. Like it'll just replace one thing with another if it has to. So it'll never be conflicted in that sense. It'll just erase one thing and use the other instead. Yes, Nancy. Global. Sorry, can't you?
So, like, flow and the flow variable you can with it.
Yep.
Change it, change it to. Is that just a problem with making global?
Yeah. I mean, global variables, global anything is just inherently like bad to use. I mean, an object is no more or less risky than an array, right? Like as long as you set the proper scope on really any variable. The scope is kind of what protects you. The idea is everyone who has access to this variable should have access to it. The reason why global is dangerous is because the idea is that everyone has access to it, potentially people who shouldn't have access, or functions who shouldn't have access to it. So it's less of an object, or is an object versus an array. It's more like what's the scope of this thing. Yeah. Ima?
Can you have verbal values for key, or is it automatically listed?
Yes, we'll talk about that in 1 second. Go in a second. Okay. And then lastly, if I want to delete a key route value pair, it is literally this operator called delete. When you delete the, so really quickly, just when you use the delete function, that will delete both the key and the value. Okay. If you want to delete a value, you're actually not deleting the value. You're just replacing that value with a null or a 0 or an undefined, right? So whenever someone says, "Oh, I deleted this key," it's implied that you're deleting the key and the value. If you just want to get rid of the value, the people say, "Oh, I overrode that value with null," or "I reassigned it to null," or "I reassigned it to undefined instead." Okay. Also, quite honestly, not very commonly used. People don't really delete object key value pairs, and the reason why is just because in general, with an array, if you loop over an array, having a bunch of extra things make it really tricky. For an object, usually it's if I have a key that I don't need anymore, I just don't access it, right? It's like you don't go into the dictionary and cross off all the words you don't think you ever use and just take them out of the book, right? It's I'll just leave it there and I'll just never look them up, right? So this operation exists, but it's not something that people use very often, and so you probably don't even have to use it in any of the workshop problems for today. This is more like an FY. Also, it's just because deleting something in engineering is in software is just typically you want to avoid deleting whenever possible because you don't ever want to permanently lose track of something. Cool. And then And then so here's where object meets for loops, which is why I did that extra thing in for loops earlier today. This concept is a little bit trickier. So well, this one not, but the next slide also uses an trick. Okay. So the in operator. The in operator basically tells you if a key exists in an object, right? Because it tells you whether or not something exists, it's going to give you back a boolean, right? You're only going to ever get two values, true or false. Either this key exists or this key doesn't exist. Okay? If the key exists but the value is undefined, well, the key still exists, right? Like it has a value to it. It may be a placeholder value. It may not be like the correct value that you want, but the key exists, right? So whenever you do, string in object, this will always give you back a boolean of true or false. Here is where we actually combine the idea of in with a for loop. So I'm gonna say, Josh, I don't know, someone else. To talk about okay, so now let's talk a little bit about keys and kind of how do I go through an object, right? With an array, with an array, the way to go through an array is to say, hey, let me just get the lowest index, the highest index, and just check every single thing, right? With an object, it's a little bit less straightforward. But one way to do it is with this we call the for in operator. And so the for on the outside looks very similar, but the inside is different, right? There's no more semicolons. There's no more different segments. It's just one thing. It's just let. This we call key. Let basically is telling us we're going to create a variable. So we could call this key whatever we want. It could be, like David's new variable, right? This could be anything we want. So the let is fixed. The in is fixed. This can be any variable we want it to be. And this is the object, right? And what this does for you, a little bit behind the scenes, is this will go through every single key for you on this object, every key that exists, okay? The reason why, typically you use this when you want to go through every single key, right? So if you want to say, hey, I want to know everything that's on this object, I would use this. If you're like, what if I only want to, check 5 specific keys on this object? Then the short answer is you wouldn't use this, right? This is typically something that you use if you want to loop through every single key in the object. Once again, this is just a tool. It's not going to suit every single purpose. If you're using this and you're saying like I want to exclude this key and this key and this key and this key, then you probably shouldn't use this to start with, right? This is designed for you to be able to loop through every single key in the object. Jillian? Yep. Okay, so hold that thought for 1 second, or one slide. So for now at least, we can see how if I do for let key in Bushin, I create this variable key, and lo and behold, it gives me the key, right? Very similar to how, if I give you the index and I give you the array, I wanted to ask you, hey, what's the element at that index? What do? I give you an array, I give you an index, and I want to know what element is at that index. What do you do? Exactly, right? We pass the index where we access the element through the bracket notation, right? We do array, square bracket, index. Same thing here, right? I have my key still. Well, if I have the key and I have the object, then the value is just, right, the object, and I pass in the key. So for in lets you access, either every key or every key and every value, or I guess typically every value in the object, right? So this is one way to do this. Leo? No, key is not a fixed word. Key can be anything. So, well, I guess when you say fixed words, you mean is it reserved, right? So it's not a reserved word. So if I want to, Okay. So if I have this, I do for, and so if I do let key in pushing console.log out push console.log out key, I get this. I can also rename this like anything I want, right? It could be like Leo's key. That's just a variable. Name it whatever you want. Yeah, you can almost think of this as saying, like let Leo's key equal quote unquote like actual key, right? Because you're just creating a variable, right? This is a variable that will go through it, and the reason why I'm saying like this is a shorthand of the cycle is because you don't actually see where they assign it, but it is doing it, right? And every single iteration of the loop is just saying, all right, this is a quote unquote first key, this is a quote unquote next key, this is a quote unquote next key. One thing to also note with objects. With an array, there's a very clear order, right? This is the first element, this is the next element, this is the next element. In JavaScript, there is no sense of order, right? Everything is kind of on the same level, right? Because if you want to access a particular key, particular value, you just say, give me this key, give me this value. There is no sense of order. And so when you loop through an object, don't assume that there's going to be an order there. The hairier explanation for this is different browsers really interpret order differently. And so if you use this and you have a certain order, in Chrome, right, versus even REPL versus ColdPin or somewhere else, like the idea is that like if you take that code and put it somewhere else, the order could actually be different. So don't assume that we use a for loop that there's going to be a set order, but you can also rest assured that this will go through every single key. So you're going to have access to everything, maybe just not in the order that you were expecting it to. Generally, the order would be the order in which the keys were created. But if you remove keys, it throws the order off depending on where you are. And so that's why, like, typically we say, like, you might think there's a pattern based on when it's created, but that may not always hold true in all environments. So it's probably just better not to make that assumption at all, right? Also, if order really, really mattered to you, use an array, right? Like this is kind of like where we start seeing these distinctions, right? Like this tool is meant to do this, and this other tool is meant to do this. If you want to try to do something with one tool with another tool, you could, but you might as well just use the original tool that was designed with that in mind, right? So arrays have order design in mind. Object, the idea is everything's kind of flat. Do you have a question, Rachel? Or okay. All right, so that's the for in loop. Yep. Okay, good. Oh, sorry. And this is to tell you that this is bad error, right? Because key is what?
Key is not in the object.
Right. Key is a variable, right? Key is not a string. So when we do dot key, we're telling JavaScript, hey, look for this key, the string key, in the object, and it's going to give us undefined all the way through, right? So once again, an instance in which you want to be careful, in this case, probably just err on the side of caution and use bracket notation instead. Object.keys, in this case, so kind of like how we talk about array.isArray. It's a method on the array class that lets you tell something's an array. Object.keys, if I pass in an object, it will give me back a list of all the keys in an array. So if I do this, then I get name, age, color. Once again, right, it loosely corresponds to the order in which the keys were created, but that's not explicitly true in every situation. So, kind of take that with a grain of salt in terms of kind of making that assumption on your own. But this will give us back a list of all the keys. And then lastly, I guess to sorry. Lastly, to Ima's question earlier of what if I want a key to have more than one value? Well, whereas a key can only be a string, a value can be anything. It could be an array. So if you have multiple values, then you can probably store all those values in an array. Because every key can only exist once and in an object, there can only be one value tied to that key as well. But that value could be something like an array, like a whole multiple strings. It could also be another object too, right? And so the same way that we can nest arrays, we can nest objects, and vice versa. And so objects can also be infinitely complex, depending on kind of how you want to set up, right? And kind of like how how yesterday we were using kind of multiple consecutive bracket notations to go deeper and deeper and deeper into a nested array. Here we're doing the same exact thing, right? If we evaluate this code from left to right, what's Pusheen? Pusheen is an object. Okay, Pusheen's dot siblings. Does it have a siblings key? Yeah, it does. Great. And what's the value of that? It's an object. Okay. And then we're using the sister dot sister. Okay, does that object have a sister key? It does. Great. What's the value? It's storm. And so, in the same way that we can chain together bracket notation, we can also chain together keys on an object, assuming the objects are nested. And we can even chain together. We can either use dot notation, and if the value is an array, we can use bracket notation right afterwards. And then if the inside of the array is an object, we can do dot notation again. Here we can also use bracket notation. It will work equally well. There's no difference between the two. The idea is that we can actually go through these things in infinite complexity. So an object can actually, in generally speaking, like most data, I would say, especially if you're going to third-party data, most data is going to come back to you in the form of an object, right? Because it's just so flexible. You can dump any key you want, any value you want, and just kind of give it to someone in kind of one wholesale bulk saying, here's everything, these are the keys, go knock yourself out. Nancy? Sorry, what?
If you were to just do pushing dot sister,
Yep.
would it find it, or would it just be like that?
Yeah, so if you do Pusheen.sister, it will say, okay, great, you want the sister key on Pusheen. It will look and say, nope, the keys are name, age, and siblings. Sister's not a key, so it will give you back undefined.
Right. Okay. So is that not
This has nothing to do with scope.
If you logged it up within the siblings bracket, would it find it?
So the short answer is no, because sister doesn't exist on Pusheen. It exists in a value of Pusheen. Right? So, it's like if someone was to ask you for something that was really one of your siblings, like you don't technically have access to it. So quite explicitly from a computer standpoint, it's just saying, does the sister key exist on Pusheen? And the answer is no, and it stops there. It doesn't look anywhere else. That's it. One level. But I think that raises a fundamental question of, okay, how do I check to see if the sister key exists anywhere in this object? I think that actually is a workshop problem, so you'll get to build that out eventually. But that's a lot more complex. In most cases, it won't do that for you naturally. Okay. Does it answer your question, Ima, of having multiple values tied to a key? Cool. Any other questions? I think this is it. Yeah.
When you're nesting objects and you're using bracket notation, do you have to do it like you do an array pretty much, where you do it like bracket 0 and then a separate bracket, or would you overlay them within like the same bracket kind of thing?
Not sure I follow that.
If you're
Do you mean curly brace?
like when you're accessing it, how in the previous example,
Yep.
and you're nesting like different key values.
Yeah.
And you want to use bracket notation.
Yeah.
Would you do it like an array where you do like say like array 1 and then you do like index 0 and then a separate like index 1 within that?
So is your question basically how I do line 13 and 14 with bracket notation?
Exactly.
Yeah. Sure. So this does. Where are those things? They're probably new line characters or like weird spaces. Okay. Anywho, not relevant. Okay. So right now when I do this prints out this. If I want to do it in bracket notation, yeah, it would just be like this, and then I would just chain these strings up like that. So lines 8 and 9 are equivalent. Both work equally well. Obviously, if that key had a space in it, I could only use line 8. Although, sorry, curiosity. Hold up. Page now. Okay, can do that. So that works. Wonder. So if I do Pusheen and do age now, that was gonna work. Cool. But what if I just do dot age now? Okay, nope, tried it, didn't work. Okay. That might work in other languages, but not JavaScript. So yeah, so if there's any spaces or anything really super weird with formatting, use bracket notation. Any other questions? Lex. Yeah.
Could you correct the offline reference?
Sure.
I'm just curious, what would happen, like, how would it output with the console log? Machine dot siblings, like, will it
Yeah.
output with the keys and the values?
It would print out the value, which is an object. So it'll just give you the object. Yep. And I mean, because it gives you back an object, that's why you can chain functions together, right? Is because essentially, if I do siblings dot brother, right? The only reason like this has to return an object to me because essentially this becomes this now, right? And I can access a brother key on an object. Yeah. Okay. Josh, did you refine the question a little bit, or did we cover it a little?
I think I may have inadvertently like discovered the difference between single quotes and double quotes.
Okay.
Because that was basically what I was asking, I guess.
How so?
Like, if you put name
Mhm.
in double quotes,
Okay.
it would return name, right? Or would it not?
Not sure I'm following, but let's try it. Okay, so let's just say I make this object super easy, right? Its name is Pusheen. It has only one key, right? So what are you trying to do right now?
I just want the word name to be logged.
You want the word name to be logged.
Like, it's never gonna do it, but I want to know if like the word name can be logged even though there's a key called name.
But you want that particular like
No,
string name to be logged.
the word name.
And how would you get access to it?
You wouldn't, right? You could just console log whatever.
Okay. I guess how does a single quote versus a double quote change that?
Because we've been using single quotes, I don't know, but
Single quotes and double quotes in JavaScript are identical. The only reason why people would use single quotes, well, so besides personal preference, the reason why the difference between single quotes and double quotes is I wanted to do something like David's class, right? That's going to throw in an error because it's going to think that this single quote meant that that's the end of my string, right? However, if I now wrap this in double quotes instead of single quotes, it then knows to treat that single quote as part of the string.
Okay.
Yeah, and vice versa, right? So if I wanted to do like, this is like quote unquote David's class, David guys. Now if I use single quotes, it will know to treat those double quotes as part of the string. So that's really the main difference in single and double quotes is that it's more of a it's easier to type quotes literally. Other than that, there's not any functional difference as far as I'm aware. To answer your question though, like if you just want to print out name, I mean the way to do that would probably be to do object.keys, and we pass in Pusheen, which would give you back this name. It would give you an array of all the keys, and in this case you probably just want the first one, so that will print out name for you. But it doesn't necessarily like it's not like a like it'd be great if you find a use case for that first, and we can talk about there's probably a better way to get to where you want to go besides doing it this way. Yeah. All right. Yeah, Leo.
You can't access individual keys based on index.
Sorry, I can't hear you. What?
You can't access like the list of keys.
Yeah.
That way.
Yeah.
So
Object.keys.
if you were to do one, go 0. What's the second one?
If I go to do one, it'll get undefined because my array only has one thing in it. Right. That was what slide was that? Slide 17.
So
Sure.
building that, if you had an object with more than that, you were saying before if you were to run just like a normal for loop on it, it could be unreliable on different browsers.
Yeah.
Because of the order.
I'm sorry.
It might be like unreliable because of the browsers if you were to run like a normal for loop or something.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like the order in which those, like in a for loop, you're going through the keys in a certain order, right? That order may or may not be consistent depending on what browser you're in. Yeah. You can read more about it. It's actually not that complicated. It's just, as you can expect, Internet Explorer was like, hey, I have this different way of doing things. And then everyone's like, no, do this other way. And IE's like, no, we like our way. And then now there's no consistent way to do it. So it's blame IE, I guess, as with most browser issues. But it has to do with basically like once you delete a key and then you re-add the key, where is that key now being added back to? Is it in its original spot, or is it now kind of shoved to the last slot? And so that causes some inconsistencies, and therefore it's just not like it's sort of an edge case, but it's just like in general, if you care about order, don't use objects. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, sounds good. Okay, feel free to take a break. I'll send out partners. Start when you're ready. It's almost 8:15 now, so around 9:15, I'll probably start the optional review, like in the other room. If you want to come hang out and just walk through some problems together. Yeah. Otherwise, fellows in the back, I'm up here. Feel free to raise your hand or use help tickets, whatever's easier. Cool. Good luck.